So, I imagine most people with televisions or internet connections have probably been asking themselves the same basic question in recent days. What the hell is going on with Shia LaBeouf? And if you happen to be in the slender minority of web denizens who haven't heard the news about Shia LaBeouf, let me bring you up to speed. In December of 2013, the precocious young star released his short film, HowardCantor.com, for free on the internet. It initially received pretty strong reviews, just as it had when he'd shown it at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2012. Why it got good reviews, I'll get into later. But it wasn't long before people noticed that the plot, dialogue, characters, and basically every other component of the film bore a striking resemblance to a 2007 comic named Justin M. Damiano by Daniel Klaus. So striking was this resemblance that the short, which did not acknowledge its source material in the credits, could only qualify as direct plagiarism. And this is where it starts getting crazy. Shia began offering a series of apologies on his Twitter page, but people began noticing very quickly that each of these apologies had themselves been plagiarized from sources as diverse as Tiger Woods' apology for his adultery, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's autobiography, and even Yahoo Answers. And people began to notice that his other artistic output, like his graphic novels, also contained material lifted from other sources without attribution. Even his earlier apology to Alec Baldwin about a conflict they had had during a Broadway play had been discovered to have been plagiarized. And despite him continually insisting that he was remorseful for what he had done, even writing an apology to Daniel Klaus in the Sky, Shia continued to defend his plagiarism on principle. For example, this interview with Bleeding Cool, where he claimed that authorship is censorship, and offered various philosophical arguments in defense of plagiarism, such as that, quote, our notion of genius as a romantic, isolated figure is outdated, and an updated notion of genius would center around one's mastery of information. And, of course, most of that turned out to have been plagiarized as well. Unsurprisingly, this has led to an avalanche of disdain and contempt for the guy as an insincere, thieving jerk, a kind of artistic Bernie Madoff, and his apology was seen as an extravagant bit of self-aggrandizement. But we hadn't seen anything yet.
Dying is easy. Comedy is hard. I believe it was Shia LaBeouf who said that.
The 27-year-old actor then took to Twitter, as per usual, to speak his mind about the funny awards show moment. He then posted a YouTube video of Jim's daughter's band, the Jane Carey Band, and called the Dumb and Dumber actor out for his parenting skills.
This was followed by Shia apologizing for what he had said, and then he announced on Twitter that he was retiring from all forms of public life, and he said the line, I am not famous anymore, which became kind of a refrain on his Twitter. He later wrote that line on a paper bag and wore it on his head at the Berlin premiere of the movie Nymphomaniac, in which he appears. And now all this weirdness has converged in his newest stunt, the I Am Sorry exhibit in Los Angeles. Patrons enter to find a table on which is a bullwhip, a toy transformer, a vase of flowers, a pair of pliers, a bottle of Jack Daniels whiskey, a pink ukulele, a bowl of Hershey's Kisses, and a container of angry tweets written about Shia LaBeouf. They're offered for the taking. There's also a copy of the graphic artist Daniel Klaus' book, The Death Ray. Once the patron picks up one of these artifacts, they go into a second room to see Shia seated at a table, wearing that same bag on his head, and just sitting there in abject silence, no matter what happens. You can even take the bag off his head and he'll just sit there without talking. The Daily Beast even seemed to get a photograph of him crying. Between all these and his repeated incidents of alcoholism and violence, it isn't hard, honestly, to see all this as just the manifestation of an unhinged mind. He obviously wouldn't be the first Disney child star this has happened to. But I do think there's some method in his madness, even if that method might itself be mad. He's trying to say something, and it's worth trying to hear what he's trying to say. Then we can evaluate that message on its own merits. It's easy to just write the guy off. I mean, he shamelessly stole someone else's story without giving them the proper credit for it, and thus depriving them of proper compensation for the use of their intellectual property. But here's the thing. Shia may be a thief, but he clearly doesn't think he's a thief, his desperate apologies to the contrary notwithstanding. It's not because he's a sociopath, or at least not necessarily. It's because that's completely consistent with his philosophy. And not just his philosophy, but the philosophy of a large segment of the population who hold on principle that the very concept of intellectual property is incoherent and should be abandoned. Ideas don't belong to anyone, they argue. They're the common property of humanity. And indeed, every story and every idea is a borrowed one. As one popular documentary arguing for this idea put it, everything is a remix. Shia explained this notion via his Twitter. We used to sit in a circle around a campfire and tell stories and share them and change them and own them together because they were ours. Now our stories are owned for profit. We buy corporate property and call it culture, enriching ourselves as we deplete others. What seems to be his honest belief, shared by many, particularly those he plagiarized in his Bleeding Cool interview, that stories belong to the community and no part of them can be claimed as their own by any individual. There's even a religion dedicated to this premise. Now, this presents an interesting problem, since Shia's biggest film roles have all been commercial exploitations of a logo, all continuations of a franchise. Indiana Jones, Transformers, even the Wall Street sequel, although of course this last film criticizes corporate culture and the effort to treat everything like a commodity. But I think that's the key to understanding Shia's performance art. Now, Murrah Wilson recently criticized Shia for not understanding performance art, but I think he actually does. So why I am sorry? What is he sorry for? I think it's not so much for what he did to Daniel Klaus, as for putting his name to exactly the kind of corporatization of storytelling that he's now denouncing, hence the presence of the bullwhip from Indiana Jones and the Transformer toy in the show. He's apologizing for making himself into a trademark, and now he's doing penance for all of that. Instead of making himself a distinct brand name, he's doing his best to make himself into nothing. Consider for a second, why did he plagiarize all those apologies? Is it because he's too lazy to write his own? Is he just addicted to plagiarism? Or is he making a statement with that? In fact, on his Twitter, he slyly admits that all these plagiarized tweets apologizing for plagiarism was done exactly to mock his critics. That admission tweet, by the way, itself a sarcastic apology, was also plagiarized. But this seems to be the point. Like Malcolm Gladwell in 2004, Shia defends plagiarism because he believes that everything we say is really a borrowed idea, and he's turning his public image into a living enactment of it by barely typing a single word that isn't borrowed. He's like the reductio ad absurdum of his own philosophy. Using all that plagiarism to apologize for plagiarism is his defense of plagiarism. And remember that Jonathan Lethem had previously written a defense of plagiarism that turned out to be entirely plagiarized. So this trick of using plagiarism to defend plagiarism has been done before. In fact, you could say Shia plagiarized the trick, which is in itself kind of a meta-commentary on itself. Shia tweeted an article pointing all of this out, which confirms to me that he's deliberately doing all this as a statement and not just being a thieving jerk. And this brings us back to his performance art show. Why is he wearing a bag over his head? Why is he sitting there silently? It seems to me that he's trying to efface himself as much as possible. He's trying to be as quiet as possible and let the various artifacts do the talking for him. And his point seems to be that the artist is comparatively irrelevant. What matters is the art. And this is driven home by the fact that this whole thing seems to be borrowed from Marina Abramovic's performance art piece, The Artist is Present, where people came and sat across the table from her and just stared at her. The artist was painfully present there. But Shia is taking that conceit and inverting it. Here, the artist is all but absent, hidden behind his art. He's gone. The artist has no voice. The artist is irrelevant. There's no such thing as authorial distinctiveness or blown romantic genius. With this in mind, I am not famous anymore becomes less a description and more of a declaration. I refuse to be famous anymore. I refuse to be a celebrity anymore. I refuse to be a patented image anymore. I'm now just a vessel for art to flow through. And I think this is what attracted him to Klaus's story in the first place. Let's look at howardcantor.com for a moment. Unattached to any of the controversy, what is it actually about? Well, let the protagonist, himself a film critic, explain.
I believe in the transformative power of cinema. It is only through this shared dream experience that we can transcend the oppressive minutiae of daily existence and find some connection in the deeper reality of our mutual desire.
The movie's about the power of cinema to change people for the better. Throughout the movie, Howard is kind of a pushover.
Let's just have the original. 2 more of the original. Same thing. Thanks.
Could I also get a
napkin?
By the end, though, his belief in the power of cinema has given him the courage to finally speak up and say what he really thinks.
And so, I hit the upload button and launched 50 unstoppable megatons of Howard Cantor into the ether.
This movie is about the power of art, which Shia clearly believes in, and this is probably why critics, at least at first, liked it so much. That and the fact that it portrays critics as being these powerful opinion shapers, which is ironic given a line like this.
Most critics will give any movie 3.5 stars if it flatters their self-image.
Again, the fact that critics initially liked this movie so much, even with a line of open declaration of intent like that, is sardonically amusing. Shia believes that art is so powerful that it should be allowed to flow freely, not be constrained or contained by notions of authorship or intellectual property. And to be fair, he did release HowardCantor.com for free on the internet so that, anyone could have access to it without having to pay for it. And he is right, of course, that, artists have always borrowed from their predecessors. The Yahoo Answers page that Shia plagiarized from was about Picasso's quote that good artists borrow, but great artists steal. And the answer he stole compared these two images as an example of how a great artist could be creative with someone else's work. T.S. Eliot similarly said, in Tradition and the Individual Talent, that the poet should in some sense be the vessel for the whole artistic tradition behind him, rather than being focused just on being creative and individual and original. And it's widely known that great artists from Homer to Shakespeare borrowed their plots from previous works. So is it true that everything is a remix and we shouldn't place so much emphasis on ownership an author has over his art? Does intellectual property even really exist? To answer that, I think we need to consider how any kind of property can exist. Going back to basics, what does property even mean? The obvious definition is that it means ownership or possession, which in turn means that if something is someone's property, they have the right of disposal over it. They can do what they want with it, and nothing can be done with it without their consent. It's the necessary precondition to the concept of theft, which means taking someone's property without their go-ahead. Okay, that's easy enough, but how does something become someone's property? The only thing that naturally belongs to us is our own body. Nothing on Earth seems to automatically belong to anyone. No one ever created any matter out of nothing. They only ever took stuff from a pre-existing creation. Thomas Aquinas actually says that God gave the Earth to humanity in common, and the existence of private property is a secondary development. So how does something go from being part of the common heritage of the Earth to being someone's private property, since no one created any of this stuff themselves? The philosopher John Locke explains it this way. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands we may say are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed with his labor with, and joined to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. This is important. Locke's point is that we already own our body and our labor, so whatever from nature we mix with our labor becomes our property as well. Pope John Paul II seemed to say much the same thing when he said, "From the beginning there is also linked with work the question of ownership, for the only means that man has for causing the resources hidden in nature to serve himself and others is his work, and to be able through his work to make these resources bear fruit, man takes over ownership of small parts of the various riches of nature, those beneath the ground, those in the sea, on land, or in space. He takes all these things over by making them his workbench. He takes them over through work and for work." The way that something initially goes from the state of nature to being property is by somebody mixing their labor with it, and then it becomes theirs. And then from there, they have the right of disposal over it, which includes the right to trade it with something else, and of course, the whole economy is built up from there. So that's property in general. What about the concept of intellectual property? Well, just as the world was given to humanity in common, so also we inherit a whole tradition of storytelling, poetry, song, and any work of art that we create will necessarily draw heavily upon the archetypes and mythic structures we were raised with. It will be made up of material that already exists. No one creates a story out of nothing. The only person who's ever had a completely original idea was God when he created the world. So, how can any part of the common intellectual inheritance become anyone's intellectual property? At one point, the poet Robert Browning wondered whether, as he put it, such a gift was ever allowed to man as to create something out of nothing like God did, since after all, humans can only ever think using pre-existing intellectual material. Browning concluded, quote, "Consider it well, each tone of our scale in itself is naught. It is everywhere in the world, loud, soft, and all is said. Give it to me to use, I mix it with two in my thought. And there ye have heard and seen, consider, and bow the head." In other words, give me material, I mix it with my thought, and I create something new like God did. Bow your heads in reverence. Aristotle distinguishes between matter and form. Matter is what something's made of, but a form is what it is. For Browning, art may have the matter of pre-existing material, but the form is all his own. And on commenting in this poem, in her book The Mind of the Maker, Dorothy Sayers says, "Without the thought, though the material parts already exist, the form does not and cannot. The creation is not a product of the matter, and is not simply a rearrangement of the matter. This represents the nearest approach we experience to creation out of nothing, and we conceive of the act of absolute creation as being an act analogous to that of the creative artist. Thus Berdiev is able to say, God created the world by imagination. It is the artist who, more than other men, is able to create something out of nothing. A whole artistic work is immeasurably more than the sum of its parts. J.R.R. Tolkien says something similar to this. Only God created out of nothing, but when an artist in the image of God builds a fictional world, he is engaging in what Tolkien called sub-creation. An artist, in other words, does create something new, does author something. It doesn't just inherit a campfire story, he turns out something new that wasn't in the universe before by virtue of mixing it with his thought. This is, of course, the only way that anything can become property, by being mixed with ourselves, whether it's our intellectual labor or our physical labor. Everything is not a remix, even though everything has been mixed. If the word creativity means anything, it has to mean that art brings about something new. And if an artist can create something new, that means their art is in some very significant sense theirs. It is the fruit and the domain of their mind. And I can think of no better phrase to express that reality than intellectual property. The artist is not irrelevant. So is Eliot wrong in saying that the poet should be an expression of the tradition more so than of himself? Actually, on the contrary, he's saying exactly the same thing that Sayers and Tolkien were saying, and we can kind of understand this by looking at his work and how he embodied the principles that he's laying down. But the funny thing is, we don't even have to look as far as Eliot. We can just look at Shia. In his attempt to disprove the idea of the importance of the artist and the author, he's actually proven it. Because remember, he's taken a performance art piece by Abramovic. In fact, he's plagiarized it, you could say, but he's actually subverted it. By adding the paper bag over his head, he's changed its message from being about the importance of the artist to being about the irrelevance of the artist. In other words, by mixing it with his thought, he's made it his own. He's changed this piece of art to make it his own intellectual property. In his attempts to refute the importance of the artist, he's actually proven it. I Am Sorry is about him trying to become anonymous. And as we can all tell, he's failed. The movie HowardCantor.com is about a guy who finds his own voice. I Am Sorry is all about Shia sitting wordlessly and denying that he has a voice. Let's hope he realizes that he's wrong very soon. Take care.
Ellen used to make fun of my taste in movies. She said I was a romantic sap who preferred art created by focus groups and committees over the idiosyncratic nuance of a singular voice. And of course, she was right.